Gettysburg Museum of History Studios.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Good morning, everyone. I am Peter Carmichael. I'm the director of the Civil War Institute here at Gettysburg College. I'm also a member of the History Department. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Thomas Flagel. He is professor of history at Columbia State Community College in Tennessee. He is the author of numerous books, including publication that he is going to speak about today, War, Memory, and the 1913 Gettysburg Reunion. It is published by Kent State in 2019. Some of you might think that this is a little hyperbole on my part, but it is not. In my 25 years of teaching at the college level, I've had lots of wonderful students, fantastic students here at Gettysburg College. I teach a class on Gettysburg in history and memory. Taught it 2 years ago. I had not read Tom's book. I assigned it to my students. It took off in discussion. I have never, and I mean never, had a discussion section in which I stood back and the students just took over. That's how powerful and how engaging this book is. And you all know me well. It's hard to shut me up, right? I know, it's a surprise to hear that. No, but it was a great discussion. It's a credit to Tom's book. You know, that's the kind of topic, and again, we all get weary of saying, well, there's nothing more to be said about the Civil War. There's nothing more to be said about Gettysburg. Certainly there's not as much room to maneuver as maybe we would like, but there are new interpretations, new ideas, new angles, new perspectives, and Thomas has done just that in what, again, is a truly outstanding book. I should note that he has his PhD from Middle Tennessee State. He specializes in public history as well as historic preservation. So it is my pleasure to welcome Tom Flagel.
Thank you, Pete, and thanks everybody for coming. I've been to Gettysburg a multitude of times. This is my first CWI. And I'm kind of intimidated by you Gettysburg experts, quite honestly. I love this. This has been fun. You guys are kind and warm and giving, just as Ashley and Pete have been, and you better stay that way. But it's just been wonderful, so thank you. What can I say about this reunion? Well, it took longer to plan than the duration of the war itself. It started in 1908 with two individuals, one a survivor of Gettysburg, saying we should have all Gettysburg veterans come back and have one great last blowout. And they had to. Time was of the essence. In 1913, the average lifespan of an American male was 51 years. The average age of a Civil War veteran was 72. But this spark turned into a flame quickly. There was a meeting of the minds of the leading figures in Gettysburg, and 2 weeks later, it was 150 people showed up. And then the state legislature started to get involved, and they appropriated $5,000 of seed money. Then the War Department said, we're interested, and eventually got $150,000 appropriated. It's $5 million to you and me. So this starts to become a national event quickly. By 1912, they say, let's not make it for Gettysburg. Let's invite every honorably discharged veteran from the entirety of the war, north, south, east, and west. And by early 1913, it was obvious this was going to be a spectacle, the likes of which the nation had never seen before. This would be the largest blue-gray reunion at the largest, deadliest battle, the deadliest war in United States history. And the United States was in a time of crisis that I will talk about, and people were talking about this will save us. The excitement was palpable. Most of the men who came here were by rail. In 1860, the United States had about 30,000 miles of rail. By 1913, we had around about 240,000. That's enough to lay a parallel track from the Earth to the moon. And they were taking some of the old rail lines that existed in the war, some that were brand new, younger than their grandchildren. And they came in droves. And it was mind-boggling how big it was. And others who couldn't get a rail line or lived a little bit closer, they would walk. One guy walked over 100 miles and came with days to spare thinking, well, I did this during the war, I can do it now. People were talking about the roads being black with traffic, with cars. The new Model T was just out. Wagons and horses. The entire area was just inundated, not only with veterans, but with people coming to see this spectacle. And Gettysburg was not much larger than it was during the war. It was only about 4,000 people who lived here. People were fearing that it would be overwhelming, and gladly it was. That one of my favorite stories about this whole thing is how much the men wanted to come here. During that time, the United States was suffering from a massive heat dome. I'm glad we don't have those anymore. But there's this threat, and people are dying from heat stroke in northern Michigan. It's 100 degrees almost every day in St. Louis. There are people in Pittsburgh who take their families and sleep out in the parks for hopes of surviving the night, and it is killing children and old people across the nation each and every day. But still they wanted to come. My favorite story is John Hawley from western Pennsylvania, 85 years old, living with his son. And his son goes, "Dad, no, you're not going." Because the invitation from a lot of states read almost like a threat. It said, yes, you're invited to come, please register, but do you understand? You are to be living in a tent and eating army fare, just as you had during the war. If you get sick, you cannot rent a room or go to a hotel, they're not available. No family is to come with you. Nobody but the veterans are allowed inside the encampment. There should be no food or shelter for anybody else. You are allowed one carry-on. That's actually true. They're only allowed one bag and they had to carry it themselves. So when they do, it's something fascinating to me that it's an inundation that even the organizers couldn't foresee. That they estimated, the camp opened June 29th, though the official anniversary was starting on July 1st. And the estimate was that we're probably going to get about 5,000 coming here. The number that actually arrived that day was 21,000 and growing by the minute. Some of the War Department were going, we are not appropriated for this. And others going, this is a wonderful problem. We'll get more mattresses, we'll get more tents, it'll be fine. But this is a question posed by me when I was trying to find a central theme to all this. I was doing the research. You guys know what it's like. You're working on something, but you can't quite find a hook on it. What ties this all together? And this was a question posed to me by my wife, who's also my chief editor, which makes the writing process interesting. But it was a fantastic question. I answered her by saying, well, obviously, I don't know. And she said, no, Tom, they are returning to see their enemy that they killed and killed them, wounded emotionally, physically, mentally. They're going back to a formative time of their lives when they were seeing things that human beings should not be allowed to see, and time and time and time again. They are excited? Why is this so? Even those who are not veterans of Gettysburg are passing through lands and memories that, even though 50 years old, can be quite traumatic revisited. A great example being when Saving Private Ryan came out, there was an 800 number for veterans who saw the movie to call to deal with the memories that would be coming back to them from their experiences in World War II, let alone Korea, Vietnam, and elsewhere. If you were to ask the organizers and the politicians and the business people, the vast majority who were the speakers at this event, why they were coming, the answer was obvious: to save our country yet again. 1913, the United States is struggling between conservatives who think about the good old days and progressives going, no, this is a new era. We have unbelievable strife overseas. The United States is struggling trying to keep securities in the Philippines, elsewhere in Southeast Asia, under control. We have a very chaotic situation and a crumbling relationship with Mexico at the border. There is threats of small wars growing into massive ones in Europe. I'm glad we don't have that anymore. This is the kind of struggle that's in their minds, let alone letting women vote, African Americans, and they're not using that word, being able to live as citizens. What can we do about this? The struggle with the economy, you name it, but this is the answer we get time and time again from the people in charge. But people weren't asking the veterans. I think back 5 years ago, on the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings, when President Macron and President Trump walked through a long corridor of American and French flags to martial music and bunting over Omaha Beach to give speeches. And behind them were a multitude of veterans and their caretakers. And the presidents gave eloquent speeches about what it was all about. And nobody talked to the veterans. So this morning, we're going to listen to the veterans. Specifically, we're going to do it through the eyes of one person, H.H. Hodges. He is a fascinating character for a multitude of reasons, not the least of which. He was born and raised and lived in the same county his entire life, Surrey, on the leeward side of the Appalachians. From my research, never owned a thing in his life, lived with his wife, who he married during the war, has struggled and tried to make a living. I've seen his name in many iterations. He belonged to the 21st North Carolina. That was here at Gettysburg, but he wasn't. He was home during the Gettysburg campaign getting married to his dear childhood friend. But his brother and relatives and others were in the unit. So he had a desire to come back to see what they saw. And his iterations are, I've seen it as Hubert, I've seen his name as Herbert, I've seen it as Hubert, I've seen it as Hubbard, it's most likely this is his dad's name. But I'm going, why is this? One of the documents told me that on a muster sheet from 1864, he signed his name with an X. The entirety of his life, he could not read or write. Neither could his wife, or his oldest daughter, or about 40% of his neighbors. That's how poor this county was. He traveled by rail, taking about a 2-hour horse ride, as far as I can tell, or carriage ride from his home to the closest terminus, that being Mount Airy in North Carolina. How he could afford this, I don't know, because there are a bunch of states that appropriate tons of money to pay for veterans to go. Indiana gave $20,000, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of $700,000, just for rail. And they knew they had to cover everybody. About 10% of their population was Confederates. They go, they're going anyway. State after state. Iowa had no regiments, and yet they appropriated $10,000. One regiment from Minnesota, $25,000. Nobody gave more than Pennsylvania, nearly $500,000. They're going to make this big. For all the talk of all the time, and all the veterans groups and all the governors in the South, and states' rights and glory and honor and the monuments, only South Carolina appropriated any money for the veterans to go, and they cobbled together about $3,000. There were newspapers and contributors and others that tried to gather a whole bunch of money, and in North Carolina there was a movie house that said, let's have all the ticket sales go to buying these guys uniforms. We want them uniformed and have them carry their battle flags. This is so contentious. It almost made this anniversary not happen. But we do know that H.H. Hodges did get a brand new uniform and wore it. The majority, from what I can tell, of the 8,000 plus Confederates who came were in uniform. The vast majority of the 55,000 plus, those coming to their own volition, those who were officially coming from the Union, were dressed in civilian garb. But there's this militarization of the Southern concept. We're going to go back there as a defiant, unified group. To what extent H.H. Hodges thought this way, I don't know, but it does speak to his perseverance in trying to get here. That this would have cost him the equivalent to you and me about $200, and I still don't know how he did it. Which explains why there's not many African Americans there. This is before the Great Migration of World War I, where the industries in the urban areas had drawn in so many African Americans to new areas out from the Deep South. This time, they're still in the South, the formerly enslaved, in Jim Crow. And the thought of getting on these trains these segregating trains with groups of militarized veterans in uniform with battle flags was not exactly inviting. There was one man who had an account at the anniversary. He was walking around, and a group of Confederates came up to him, slapped him on the back and say, "We're so glad you're here, good to see you. We have Negroes as big as you back home." They didn't say Negroes. There's this whole idea from David Blight in his 2001 Race and Reunion that this was the whole idea of reconciliation among whites to say, well, let's just all agree we don't like blacks. That has been so debunked, I don't need to go into it further. But there is something to be said about those traveling from the South, that they are traveling through areas, and when you guys know, when you get close to Gettysburg and through the Washington, D.C. area, you are seeing battlefield after battlefield after battlefield after cemetery, after bad memories. I do know his train passed by Arlington. Others talked about how they had still seen the trench works in extended throughout the area. And that must have been difficult. They also said they felt like they were being watched. And they were. There were people who got little baskets and picnics and sat on the berms and to see the trains go by, because this was massive special traffic across the country. But they were watching for different reasons, saying, this is exciting. Look at all these guys coming. But when he got there, H.H. Hodges must have been amazed. It was a throng, the likes of which I don't know if he could comprehend. I would give anything to have seen his face. Because he gets off the train and it is this carnival. And in fact, one guy from the New York Times said, imagine the most chaotic street carnival you've ever seen and magnify it by 1,000. There was martial bands and bunting and music and all kinds of civilians all over the places, and horses and cars and carriages and noise. Here's Daniel Sickles, who showed up, the last surviving Corps commander. And it's good to see in this photograph that he's enjoying himself. He was such a wallflower who didn't like attention. I'm just glad he could just, break out of his shell and come down and see everybody. And then on his way from the train station and walking south, he had passed by a little impromptu place called Meadsboro that had 150 journalists in it from across the country, 30 photographers, all kinds of telegraph wires hovering above his head. He would go up to the very top, and when he started going, and what I love about the removal of the old visitor center in the cyclorama is that we're starting to see Cemetery Hill as a hill again. That we're reclaiming that property, and the texture of the environment is coming back to us. So credit to all of those who worked so hard to reclaim that environment. When he gets to the hill, he witnesses something amazing, a polygon 2 miles by 1 mile. Mind-blowing to him, because he looked out upon 5,000 brand new brown tents. They call it the Brown City. And over 40 miles of new gravel roads, electric wires and lights, telephone wires and telephones all over the place. It was almost twice the size in population than the entirety of his home county. He sees this brand new group that's been formed just a couple of months called the Boy Scouts. And they were there to help out. And many guys who were struggling just appreciated all they had to do is wave their hand. And there was a young man eager to help and carry a bag, find some water. One officer said, it was so wonderful, but then at the same time, these boys were not much younger than the troops I had. And the ones I lost, I remember as young forever. This is a bit haunting. There was 71 nurses and 20 doctors, a multitude of aid stations, temporary hospital. The United States had no professional nursing school in the United States during the war. We were really familiar with names like Enfield, Springfield, Remington, but we were unfamiliar yet with names like Lister and Pasteur. It was a bad time to fight a war, because as we know, 2/3 who die from what? Yeah. But They're going to prevent this. The United States government's going to prevent this. The state of Pennsylvania is going to prevent this. They do inspections of all wells and basins around the area, close a third of them. They create water here that supplies 1 million gallons a day with pumps manned all the time, fresh, clean water for these guys to be taken care of. There are inspections of cooks and bakers. A bunch of them are sent home. This is not going to be a spectacle of embarrassment. Think back to the American war with Spanish and the Philippine insurrection thereafter. So many of these young men didn't come back because they were getting tainted food and getting sick, lack of medical care. This has got the national spotlight on it, and they can't afford to lose a single man by sickness. This is a progressive era in action. All throughout the camp, there were water-cooled underground pipes that had water bubbling out all the time. The men could find all kinds of things to satiate themselves. The thing they enjoyed the most was the medical care shown to them, largely because not only did they not really see much of that during the war, they weren't seeing it much at home. They loved the idea that during the war, they had taken care of their government, and now in their twilight years, the government was taking care of them. At the very base, close to the Kadoorie House, is the great tent where most of the grand events are supposed to happen. To give you an idea how big this is, 13,000 people can fit in this. That's slightly more than the number of people Lee sent forward in Pickett's charge. It's just something mind-boggling. They would come in around the perimeter of the camp and register. One New Jersey man remembered a Confederate grabbing him by the arm and saying, "Put my name down, will you?" And I wonder if that was Hubbard, because he couldn't sign his name. They would start to walk with their one carry-on through the camp, trying to find it. It was a bit complicated, because with all the organization and the grid work and directions and the Boy Scouts, the organizers laid out the streets by number and the tents by number. And as a consequence, especially at dark, a lot of these guys got lost and frustrated. So the states each had their own idea. What they did was set up these impromptu headquarters with a slightly larger tent and say, here's the organizing area, come here and we'll help you find your tent. For H.H. Hodges, he had an advantage that for the North Carolina headquarters, they put up a banner of a big old foot. That helps. Anybody from North Carolina in here? No? I'm glad. We're free to talk. It's a strange bunch. But nonetheless, when he gets there, again, a brand new tent, and he can poke his head in, and even though it's hot, a lot of people say it's like a furnace. He sees cots. It's supposed to hold 12 people. They say, no, just 8, give you a little space. Brand new cots, 2 blankets, a mess kit for you to have, a wash basin, anything you need, the schedule of all the meals. It was wonderful. Here's a picture of one of the brand new cots, and I contemplate in the book whether this guy is looking for a nice place to rest or he's just looking for better roommates. I don't know. But I will tell you on why did they go. I'm going to share 4 of the many things these veterans taught me. And it struck me when I read this and saw it in the photographs and the newspaper reports, diaries, and accounts, that number one reason they came was to find a place of personal meaning. Time and time and time again, they would go, not to the famous spots, you and me, they would go to a place that they had personally experienced. And many men thought it was just amazing that they were here just a few minutes. A lot of the topography would start coming back to them. For H.H. Hodges, he probably went to the base of East Cemetery Hill. And this is very much what it looked like in 1913. Winfield Scott Hancock's statue was up at that time. And this was where, as many of you know better than me, the 21st North Carolina on the night of July 2nd came up around about this area and charged the hill several times. The fighting got primal. Men were beating each other with fists and using their guns as clubs, using rocks to club each other to death. One Union veteran said it was hard to get out of his mind what it was like blasting cannon at short range and watching the bodies disintegrate and having the heads roll down the hill as if they were pumpkins poured out of a wagon. For him to go there helped him understand what his family and friends and neighbors were talking about. For others, they would go to a specific place for various reasons. One, he was an 80-year-old man. He wanted to get up to the second story of a building. Two men carried him up the stairs, and he nearly broke down because he said, I was so afraid this building didn't exist anymore. I was held as a prisoner here for 2 days. That it's still here means so much to me. Another one went to the very spot where he had to leave his brother behind as they were going up Culp's Hill. In a way, you can see this time and time and time again, an enormous amount of survivor guilt. Coming back after 50 years, trying to make amends of what they had done and seen. We interpret this as a national event. And indeed, the words like reunion and commemoration and jubilee gives it an idea of a collect. It's very personal. And I've seen this time and time again with veterans I've worked with. July 1st, the first official day of the event, the organizers call it Veterans Day. Well, that's great. But at the Great Tent, they had almost no veterans talk. The main speaker that time, you would seem like it was an appropriate theme, but what he does, my gosh, get back here. Oh, darn it. Oh yeah, this is the keynote speech that day that this is repeated again and again and again and again. But he says, so long as men love valor and worship heroes, the name of Gettysburg and those who fought here will ever be on their lips. No man of pure spirit ever lived than those who waged it upon the respective sides. That came from, and you think it's a relatively valid person to have, Lindley Garrison, the U.S. Secretary of War. Lindley Garrison was a lawyer from New Jersey. He had never been in the military, never saw a minute of combat. And he talks about the superfluous, unctuous stuff about how great and honorable and valor and courageous war is and how fantastic it is and how amazing you are. But he doesn't have any of the veterans speak. Veterans came out of this thinking, well, we're gods of war, that's great, but I love the food. And they were told, you're going to eat Army fare. And they came in, this olfactory explosion of bakeries going full time all day long, fresh bread. They had green beans and soup. They had ice cream, refrigerated rail cars, pie, pulled pork, all kinds of wonderful sandwiches almost any time of the day they really wanted because there was surplus. Hot coffee anytime they desired. It was absolutely wonderful. It was a feast. How many times you guys go on cruises and people talk about the food that was on the boat? It's the same thing. What's amazing about this is that when they started collecting at the multitude of places they didn't have to stand in line for, the kitchens were just lined up along the streets, they started to run into a lot of the men they had met before, but not had seen, in some cases in 50 years. They started to mingle and spend an enormous amount of time speaking with individuals that they were running into. One guy was just walking down the street, felt an arm grab him by the shoulder, pulled him around, and he was embraced by somebody from the same company, and they had not seen each other since the end of the war. It's remarkable how this happens time and time and time again, and here is the second reason, big one, that they were coming here. That being is to find old comrades. Now, there's a bit of a challenge here because this is the camp, massive. But the organizers said, all right, here we go. This is the Pennsylvania section, the largest section. I'm living in Tennessee, the small one. I'm actually originally from Iowa. This is right behind the McMillan house. Here's the New Jersey section for those of you from New Jersey. Right here's North Carolina section, for example. But the organizers, even when the veterans begged them not to do this, said, please, could we be housed with our old units and even our old enemies? And the organizers said, no, you have to stay where you are living currently. Now, if you're looking for old comrades, what's the problem? You're far away from them most of the time. Most people are not like H.H. Hodges. Arizona had 2 tents. There were 7 guys from 6 different states. And they had to just go wandering This was a difficult thing for them. They would wear these hat bands. Thankfully, a lot of the vendors had hat bands. One guy wore a sash with the name of his regiment and company on it. He didn't need to. He was 6'4". Others would just scream out their units trying to find somebody. William Fickus, who was from Indiana, when he was at the battle, was in the U.S. 4th Artillery. But nobody from that unit came, so he went to go look for his old unit, the 14th Indiana. And Indiana was laid out on this long, long street. And he just kept going down the tent line. Anybody from the 14th? Anybody from the 14th? Anybody from the 14th? No answer. He finally came behind into one tent, poked his head in, and saw an old face somewhat familiar with a long beard. And he said, "It's just me, Frank. I'm the only one." Thankfully, they eventually found out they weren't the only ones. It turns out that a bunch of people from the 14th had been there, just they had to wander and wander to find them. One of the most tragic stories involved the tent mate of William Fickus. It was a man by the name of Joshua Vinson, who was with a Virginia Cavalry Battalion. He got sick, heat sickness on the first day, and you guys know what it's like. It just drags you out. And he's stuck on this cot. And he says, "Guys, go and see if you can find anybody from my unit. Tell them to come visit me." During the entirety of the reunion, nobody came. So he had to sit there lying, wondering if nobody from his unit was there, or nobody was still alive, or nobody remembered who he was. Many men, in order to see old comrades, this was the main thing for the Union veterans, was to go up to the cemetery and wander, and many men found many names. They would describe remembering individuals there, and they could just picture their young faces. They couldn't imagine them as old people anymore. One man was seen sitting next to us in one of the flat stones and just saying over and over and over again, "He's under there." And he couldn't be consoled, and he eventually collapsed, and they took him to an aid station. The story of valor and courage and godlike behavior in battle, I've seen it time and again. It doesn't register. July 2nd, Military Day. Okay, this is great. The organizers finally get some veterans to talk, but most of the individuals are still magnates and politicians, senators, governors, really wealthy people, lawyers who are talking underneath the tent. And it turns out the veterans already know this is a waste of time. What they do is realize they have other things to do elsewhere. One journalist said, "The exercises in the great tent were interesting, impressive, and well attended, but there seemed to be more pleasure for the majority in wandering over the battlefield or visiting about the camp." One veteran said, was asked, "What did you guys do when you went there?" And he said, "We scattered." Something that I find interesting about veterans is that when they come to reunions, when they're in large groups, they cut up and they're just joyous. But after a while, they will break up into 2s and 3s, and then it gets quiet. Shout out to Harold Holzer, who does such a wonderful job talking about the power of visuals on this, something that struck me when I was looking at so many of the photographs. Here's another thing that shows up with this. Notice something that's happening in these photographs of the 1913 reunion again and again and again. There are women inundating this camp. It turns out that the organizers said, "No families coming, you're not going to bring them, no provisions, nothing." And the veterans said, "Okay, shut up. I'm bringing my wife, I'm bringing my daughter, I'm bringing my cousin. I need the help, I need the company, I want them to show them." A lot of people showed up, actually making this a family affair. There was one unit that actually had a majority of the men bring their family. One guy said, I can bring you with me this time, Lily." There were even women who had lost their husbands and went back to see what the battlefield looked like and see if they couldn't find where he had fallen. James Longstreet's widow was here as a reporter. There was one woman who was a little girl who lived just beyond Culp's Hill and could see the hill pulsating with light and noise during the battle, waking up to find the vast majority of her countryside was devastated. One vast hospital, as Gregory Coco called it, and called into service to take care of these men. The women didn't get credit for that, but the veterans gave them credit. and started to talk to the people. She and her family moved away from this tormented area and the greater safety away from the war to Wisconsin. But she came back as an older woman to see this place. And when she saw it, she saw the same thing and reacted the same way the men did. This place healed. It's beautiful. And the men are healing. Which brings us to the idea of the myth of the term of battlefield. There's no such thing as a battlefield. These are people's homes and their gardens and their churches and their towns. And decimated. And I don't think we cover that nearly well enough. We see it now in places like the Sudan and Gaza. I think we need to place that same context here. It is not just a military event. And indeed, one of the reasons why the men had all these women come is that they were really trying to reconnect with their humanity. Even during the war, under secured areas of the Union, they would bring family members because they were trying to reestablish who they were. There were so many instances, Megan Kate Nelson really covers this really well, that these men were really civilians during the war. 97% before the war were civilians, never were in the military, and most of them got out of the military as soon as they possibly could. And they really tried to reestablish their civilian selves whenever they could in peacetime during the war. Printers became printers again. Carpenters tried to work with wood again. And musicians started to play music again. Gamblers repented. No, but there was this idea of reestablishing oneness. One of my favorite stories is that a cavalry unit from New York came into town looking for women who were in their 50s and 60s. Don't get creepy on me. What they were doing is looking for women who were little girls during the battle, because when they rode into town, they were welcomed by little kids with flags, homemade, singing patriotic songs. And they found 6 of them that I could find. They took them to a tent. There was a couple of musicians around, and the men said, sing, rally around the flag, boys. And the women go, we can't. They said, please. And the women started to sing with their broken voices. And the men told the musicians to shut up. And it became so moving that nearly everyone started to sob. One man had a little purple ribbon that he had saved. It was wrapped around a bouquet of wildflowers that a little girl had given him, saying, thanks for coming to protect us. He had saved it his whole life, brought it back to the reunion, and said to one woman, are you the person who gave this to me? I think you are. And she goes, I don't remember. I don't think I am. He had such a desire to have that reconnection. He sat down on his seat, just utterly dejected. So July 3rd, the great apex, the high tide of the Confederacy, the Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the saving of the Union. The organizers were brilliant. They decided to call this day Governor's Day. What? Seriously? But come on, read the room. But what they did was, at least they were honest. At the great tent, and it's not nearly as populated as this. This was on day one. They had 10 governors speak. And it was the same thing over and over again. Courage and honor and valor. Men, the vast majority of them never were in the military. And the organizers also said, this is what we're going to do. You're going to love this. What we're going to do is recreate Pickett's charge. H.H. Hodges couldn't participate because the 21st had been so decimated. On July 2nd, they were not part of this charge. They lost 28% of their men. But it would be Virginia, not North Carolina or anybody else. Again, Virginia is still reclaiming that. That charge is their own. And the controversy continues. And what it was at 3 o'clock, at the heat of the day, the 72nd Pennsylvania was said, you're going to be the only ones, you're going to be at the angle, you come here, you stay here. You Virginia veterans, what you're going to do is recreate your march. And this is a bit of a problem. Here is the Virginia area of the camp, and here is where they had to walk. A civic band playing Dixie over and over and over again led them. The men went by 2 by 2, many of them helping themselves up, through the Timothy grass and across the railroad tracks that used to intersect this area, and all the tent ropes and camps and traffic and people in the heat of the day for nearly a mile. Some are on crutches, some have pin sleeves. One from the 72nd Pennsylvania looked out and said, 50 years ago, I didn't think I was going to live. Today, I don't know if they will. They came within 20 paces of each other, and the organizer said, stop. Now we're going to give you something you deserve, and you want, and you'll love. Another speech. This is J. Hampton Moore, essentially the representative of the 72nd. That he is from Philadelphia. He's their congressman, a very successful lawyer, but born after the battle, never served in the military, never saw anything, stood on the wall itself and proceeded to lecture the men, a blow-by-blow recount of Pickett's charge itself. And you had to wonder if the veterans were going, listen, been there, done, no wait, been here, done that. And he just went on and on and on. And eventually, after about 20 minutes or so, he finally finished, took a deep breath, and said, in the days of Betsy Ross. Where is this going? Is he going to go all the way back to like when George Washington was in vitro or something? And they go, if we just had our guns, we could scare him off. But finally, when he is done with his windbaggery, it finishes, and the organizer said, and now the ceremony is over. At least one man had to be dragged away because he had collapsed from exhaustion. Others are going, what? And they did what they've been doing all week. They broke up into groups and started to mingle. Some hugged, some laughed, some cried. Those observing from the outside going, oh, this is reconciliation. This is what it is. No, it's shared experience. I've seen it from veterans from Vietnam and Korea and elsewhere. I hate the government I fought against. I'm not cool with communism. I'm not really going to send a Christmas card to Al-Qaeda. No, I'm not going to do that. But I can kind of understand that young kid who went through the same terror I did. My family can't understand. Strangers can't understand, but he can. We cited this time and time again from cancer survivors, rape survivors, 9/11 survivors, that when they meet for the first time and realize of their shared experience, they don't have to speak, they just connect with a shake in the hand, a look in the eye, that finally somebody knows what I went through. I'm not alone. I talked to a lot of people in my psych department at school, and they said, this is so important. It can be 50 years later, they still have to have reminders that other people survived and the emergency is over. When they mingle like this, I can't imagine the healing experience. It's a fascinating phenomenon I see in veterans time and time and time again, that they will talk to somebody who experienced the same thing first, then they'll talk to a veteran second, then they will talk to a stranger like me next, and they will talk to a family member last. I don't know how many times I've been in interviews of veterans. My secondary specialization is oral history. We will come out of the den or bedroom, and the family or the wife will say, you've been in there 2 hours. I can't get him to talk for 2 minutes about this stuff. I once finally asked a veteran, why is this so? I mean, I've seen this time and again. Why is this so? And he said, I don't want them to see Grandpa as broken. I want them to know me as me, not me as him back then. I don't want to be that man anymore. I have my family. How do you think I survived this? And I was just struck. Reason number 3 was to find other survivors. There was a healing element to this when men are, I found this really poignant on artillery men, when they were launching shells into certain areas and just watching the bodies just disintegrate. When they see the units they were shooting at and men who had survived a long time and lived full lives, there was a sense of relief. There's not only survival guilt that we see at this and many other places, there's also murder guilt. It has come to my attention that human beings are not natural-born killers. And when they do it, they have a really difficult time dealing with it. Despite the fact we keep talking about this at Memorial Day and Veterans Day, and all this valor and glory and honor and putting veterans up on a pedestal and thus out of reach makes them essentially statues that don't have feelings. I don't say thank you for your sacrifice anymore. I don't say thank you for your service anymore. Whenever I see a veteran, I say, I'm glad you're back. If you want to talk, I'm here. If you don't, let's do donuts. This happens again and again and again. This reconciliation with the self, the shared experience, the dealing with the trauma itself, a Greek word that means wound. The organizers kept trying to do their best. They said July 3rd, this was scheduled for July 4th, but what we're going to do, you're going to love it. We've been working on this for a long time, digging platforms on Little Round Top. I'm glad we don't have construction on Little Round Top anymore. And they said, well, you're going to love this. I said, great, as soon as the night falls, what we're going to do is give you something you really love, a fireworks display. Yeah, you're groaning for a good reason. What? You guys know. Sensitivity to loud noises, sensitivity to bright lights, difficulty sleeping, long-term memory loss, short-term memory loss, irritability, self-medication. Those are signs of what? Yeah, it's post-traumatic stress disorder. Those who had not gone through this sort of thing just couldn't comprehend it. One veteran said, it's just too close. It's too much. July 4th. The fascinating thing is the camp is almost dead. That people either found what they were looking for or didn't find it at all and left. And this ends up being a somber thing. This is called National Day. Just as well, the president, Woodrow Wilson, shows up. He was not going to go. He was scheduled to go, but he didn't want to. His wife goes, this is a national event. You got to go. You're just president. You need to show a good face. You go there. And he comes, and the army, the regular army was there for security, makes this corridor that he marches down with all these generals and officials. And right before he goes into the tent, they go, stop, 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 stop. We have to find a Union veteran and a Confederate veteran, put him right by the president. There we go, here's a photograph. There was the one and only time he came in contact with veterans. He went into the tent, again, not amplified, traffic from Gettysburg Road, people didn't hear it. A couple of veterans came in there and were really disappointed. It was a watered down version, really tepid, of the Gettysburg Address. It was a ripoff and didn't work. People were really angry. What Woodrow Wilson did is leave right after saying the same thing. We are made of these tragic, epic things to know what it costs to make a nation, the blood and sacrifice of multitudes of unknown men. Unknown men, blood and sacrifice. In fact, you would have been better off if you died. Leaves out of the back, gets in a car, hops a train, goes on vacation. Abraham Lincoln in 1863 was here for 24 hours. Woodrow Wilson was here for about 45 minutes. And he should know better. He had seen the war as a kid. He had also missed the most solemn close to this. At noon, and he left just a few minutes before, there's going to be 5 minutes of silence. If you can stand for everyone who has died in the war and thereafter, in solemn memory. July 4th, you and I get a keg and blow stuff up and listen to Alan Jackson for some other reason. They took a moment and did the most solemn, beautiful thing possible. And Woodrow Wilson missed it. They started to climb back, the last of them, onto their trains, including H.H. Hodges, to return to his wife of 50 years. When H.H. Hodges was about to get on the train, collapsed and died. This is how I know about him. We historians oftentimes get a lot of documentation on terrible events. News stories, insurance reports, tragedies, obituaries. It's one of the reasons why we're not often invited to parties. You know, the joke being, on average, how many historians are at a party? The answer is 0. That's why it's a party. But there's something that struck me as these men left. The souvenirs included bayonets and bullets, and a lot of them were fake, and plates with battlefield scenes on them. These men took with them their mess kits, little bits of food, Men who were involved in Pickett's Charge plucked leaves off the copse of trees which were established at the time. Others had taken flowers and blossoms. A couple of them took whole bags full of dirt, saying, I'm going to plant flowers back home or make a garden of this. They took photographs, took down names, shared stories. Back of the tent, the politicians and the magnates and the lawyers and the millionaires were talking about death, death, death. These men were preserving life. And comes to our final reason, number 4, to reaffirm life itself. I look around this crowd and you're like me. We're going to more funerals than we are baptisms. We've lost friends recently. We will lose more soon. And I learned this from cancer survivors and tornado survivors and veterans again and again and again. 2 things you can't get back. It's life and time. When the government keeps talking about death, these guys keep talking about life. They continue to teach me the living and the gone veterans and the civilians and all the people I work with and all the people I meet. I'm a cynic at heart and pessimistic, but in my late years, they're right. The most precious thing we have is life and time. And I mean it when I say, thanks for being alive, and thanks for sharing time with me. Thank you.